With all that which a person allows to appear, one may ask, what is it meant to hide? What should it divert the eyes from? How far does he deceive himself in this action? Humans are adept at deception. Throughout our lives, we deceive others as to our intentions, our beliefs, and our actions. But more impactful may be the ways in which we deceive ourselves. In this video, we will examine the phenomenon of self-deception, looking at why we do it, the dangers that arise from it, and whether we can rid ourselves of harmful deceptions and in the process improve our lives. Humans are imperfect beings. Each one of us is flawed in a diverse number of ways. We make countless mistakes, are unsuccessful in many of our endeavors, and are victims of numerous bad habits. Yet despite all this, we have a basic need to think well of ourselves. We want to believe that we are good people and that the path in life we have chosen is a noble one. The easiest way to reconcile our need for a positive self-image with the existence of our many flaws and shortcomings is through hiding our defects, both from ourselves as well as others. In this pursuit, we are often far more successful in deceiving ourselves than we are at hiding our flaws from those close to us. This has been expressed by many thoughtful observers of the human condition across cultures and throughout human history. A famous passage from the New Testament reads, "Why do you see the speck in your neighbor's eye, but do not notice the log in your own eye?" While an ancient Japanese proverb conveys a similar message. Though you see the 7 defects of others, we do not see our own 10 defects. Deceiving ourselves as to our flawed character is sometimes referred to as internal masking. But self-deception takes another form called external masking, whereby we deny aspects or events of the outer world which pose a threat to our self-image. For example, someone who believes they are a well-liked person may remain oblivious to social cues pointing to the fact that others dislike them. The use of internal and external masking creates what can be called our noble lie. This is the fictitious story we tell ourselves to maintain a positive self-image in the face of our many flaws. While having a positive self-image is beneficial, problems arise when it is too reliant on the use of internal and external masking. For if our self-deceptions become too flaunting of reality, we become akin to an individual walking over a deep chasm on a poorly constructed bridge. The chasm was life itself, wrote Leo Tolstoy in his book Anna Karenina, The Bridge, that artificial life. While the bridge of our self-deceptions may hold for many years, we always face the risk that the bridge will break, and we will be forced to confront the chasm of life, which after years of lying to ourselves and denying, rather than dealing with our weaknesses, we will be ill-equipped to cope with. There are many instances in every life where one's self-deceptions begin to falter, presenting an opportunity to break down the false self. A process which, while difficult, is extremely beneficial in the long run. However, at such times, faced with the terrifying prospect that one's character was in many ways built on a lie, it is far more likely that people will flee further in the opposite direction, piling deception on deception. To do this, we run to the comfort of our daily routines, busy ourselves with social concerns, accumulate more material things, and turn to the security of conformity. There are insects that protect themselves against attackers by raising a cloud of dust, wrote Kierkegaard. Likewise, man instinctively protects himself against the truth by raising a cloud of numbers. While conformity and the playing out of social roles can help shore up our bridges of self-deception, this may in the end turn out to be more of a curse than a blessing. For given the brevity of life, it is far better to become aware of our deceptions while we still have time to change. But sadly, it is often only when one is at death's doorstep that they come to recognize the vanity and falseness of their existence up to that point. This idea is illustrated in the death of Ivan Ilyich, one of Leo Tolstoy's masterpieces. The main character in this work is a Russian magistrate who attains great success in rising to the top of Russian society. However, while enjoying the fruits of his labors, he becomes afflicted by a terminal illness, and reflecting deeply on the meaning of life, is haunted by a nagging feeling that his life was wasted.
Hey kid,
It is as if I had been going downhill while I imagined I was going up, and that is really what it was. I was going up in public opinion, but to the same extent life was ebbing away from me.
Waste
And now it is all done, and there is only death. This passage by Tolstoy strikes at the root of the danger of living at the mercy of our self-deceptions. Maintaining our illusions requires a massive amount of time and energy, and often diverts our attention to vain pursuits. Therefore, our ability to engage in projects and strive after goals which would lead to a more fulfilling life is greatly restricted. To ensure that we don't face years, if not decades, relying on our many self-deceptions, it is still within our ability to break down our false self.
Proceed.
Ooh, I can hear his heartbeat.
Blood pressure's good too. Your turn?
Okay.
Down our false self. Self-deceptions are rooted in beliefs which at some point in the past we seriously entertained, as it was awareness of our faults and the pain that accompanied them that produced the deceptions in the first place. Thus, deep down it can be said that we all know the manner in which we deceive ourselves. Nietzsche suggested that one way we can make our faults more palatable is by viewing the development of our character as analogous to the creation of a work of art. In its initial stages, a work of art contains numerous flaws. However, an artist who deceives himself regarding these flaws never creates anything of worth. Instead, a true artist must learn to observe the flaws and make the necessary corrections. Some flaws may be beyond the artist's ability to correct, but instead of pretending they do not exist, the artist can strive to find a purpose for them that contributes to the work as a whole. In a similar vein, with an awareness of our own flaws like an artist, we can attempt to overcome them, or when this is not possible, accept them and see them as an expression of our uniqueness. To give style to one's character, wrote Nietzsche, a great and rare art. It is practiced by those who survey all the strengths and weaknesses of their nature, and then fit them into an artistic plan, until every one of them appears as art and reason, and even weaknesses delight the eye. To succeed in this approach, according to Nietzsche, we should sculpt our character under the constraint of a single taste, selecting a life project to act as a guide for our creation. Without this constraint, we run the risk of losing ourselves in possibility, that is, of becoming overwhelmed by the myriad of choices regarding what to do and who to become. But before we can choose an appropriate life project, we must become aware of the weaknesses and flaws our deceptions are masking. For a clearer vision of who we are will allow us to survey what options are realistically open to us. So the seeker of his truest, strongest, deepest self, wrote William James, must review the list carefully and pick out the one on which to stake his salvation. All other selves thereupon become unreal. In bringing to fruition this new self of our creation, Nietzsche suggested that the use of deception may still be required. However, the deception in this case would not be rooted in the need to mask our weaknesses, as this only leads to stagnation. Rather, in becoming what Nietzsche called the true poets and continuous creators of life, he advocated the use of a subtle form of deception as a tool to initiate our transformation into the self we are striving to become. Nietzsche understood that very often it is our actions which precede a change in our emotions and belief structures. Thus, if one is striving to remake themselves, initially they will need to act in a somewhat fraudulent manner. Or in other words, they will need to act as the person they have not yet is to himself and listens to his own lie comes to a
Guardian,
point that he cannot
what puzzles
distinguish
do
the
you
truth
bear?
within him or around him, and so loses all respect for himself and for others.
The oldest contains
I believe Nietzsche would be just about as grateful to his rescuers as somebody who has jumped into the water to drown himself and has been pulled out by some fool of a coast guard. I have seen Nietzsche in states in which he seemed, horrible to say, as though he were only pretending to be mad, as though he were glad to have ended this way. In this two-part video series, drawing from Nietzsche's writings, letters, and reports from family and friends, we are going to explore the fascinating but ultimately unanswerable question: why did Nietzsche go mad? I undertook something that not everyone may undertake, Nietzsche wrote in the dawn of day. I descended into the depths. I bored into the foundations. The human being has traveled to the ends of the earth, dived into the depths of the sea, shot himself into outer space, and yet the human mind remains a frontier few dare to explore. For the danger of descending into these depths is madness, as the mind contains wondrous surprises, but also dark and deceptive abysses. Furthermore, in the remote reaches of the mind there are no maps, no markers, no technological helpers, and no guides one can follow. One must go it alone. For all but the most courageous adventurers, it is much more prudent to remain at the mind's surface. Whoever looks into himself as into an enormous world space and carries galaxies within him, he knows how irregular all descent into the depths of the mind, and his explorations yielded remarkable discoveries. Sigmund Freud went so far as to remark that Nietzsche developed more penetrating knowledge of himself than any other man who ever lived, or is likely to live. Yet suddenly, at the age of 45, his introspective explorations ended in madness, an occurrence Nietzsche seemed to have predicted. In 1881, 7 years before his final break, Nietzsche wrote in a letter to a friend, "At times a premonition runs through my head that I am actually living a very dangerous life, since I am one of those machines that may explode." As the sun was setting on 1888, Nietzsche was staying in Turin as a guest in the home of a prominent family, and it was at this time his behavior took a fateful turn. In late November, while sauntering through the streets, Nietzsche reported increasing difficulty hiding his laughter and controlling his intense fits of glee. My face was making continual grimaces in order to try to control my extreme pleasure, including, for 10 minutes, the grimace of tears. Throughout the month of December, his letters were no longer signed off with the name Friedrich Nietzsche, but with the name Dionysius, Nietzsche Caesar, or else the Crucified. In the period between Christmas and New Year, the guests in the house where Nietzsche was staying reported that for 3 days and nights, Nietzsche remained locked in his room and, while naked, improvised on the piano and sang and danced like a wild man possessed in what appeared to be a one-man recreation of a Dionysian festival. On January 3rd, 1889, while in the streets of Turin, upon witnessing a horse being whipped by its coachman, Nietzsche wrapped his arms around the horse, collapsed, and passed out, and it is this event that many point to as signifying his break into madness. Over the next few days, Nietzsche regained enough lucidity to write a few strange but beautiful letters to friends and family, and on January 7th of 1889, Nietzsche's closest acquaintance, Franz Overbeck, arrived in Turin to bring Nietzsche home, and days later, Overbeck reported that Nietzsche was entirely in his deranged world from which, in my presence, he never emerged again. Quite clear about who I and other people were, he was in darkness about himself. In ever more intense attacks of singing and crashing about on the piano, he came forth with fragments of the world of thought he had recently inhabited. Sometimes, in a whisper, he produced sentences of wonderful luminosity, but also uttered terrible things about himself as the successor of the now dead god. The whole performance continually punctuated on the piano. What happened to Nietzsche? The most common explanation is he suffered from general paresis of the insane, that is, dementia caused by neurosyphilis. In the early 20th century, the German ethnologist Erich Hodach sent Nietzsche's medical records to a handful of eminent doctors, and after receiving their diagnosis, he concluded, "There is no evidence of such a syphilitic infection. In all probability, there can be no definite verdict on the matter because of the inadequacy of the data." More recently, the philosopher Julian Jung noted that the symptoms of neurosyphilis are not consistent with Nietzsche's condition. In 2003, Dr. Leonard Sachs, noting the weakness of the syphilis explanation, proposed that Nietzsche's madness was the result of a slow-developing tumor on the right optic nerve of his brain. While plausible, Julian Jung again notes some weaknesses in the tumor explanation, specifically the lack of evidence in the many photos of Nietzsche to show any swelling or alterations in the size or shape of his eye and pupil. And so,
as you're watching this, some of the last old growth trees and rainforests across British Columbia.
in 1940, George Orwell wrote, "Almost certainly we are moving into an age of totalitarian dictatorships, an age in which freedom of thought will be at first a deadly sin and later on a meaningless abstraction. The autonomous individual is going to be stamped out of existence." George Orwell's dystopian novel 1984 is a work of fiction, but much that is depicted in it reflects the political realities of many nations, past and present. At least 3/4 of what Orwell narrates is not negative utopia, but history, Umberto Eco wrote. Referring to his time spent in Belgrade under communist rule, Lawrence Durrell wrote that, "Reading 1984 in a communist country is really an experience, because one can see it all around one." In this video, we are going to explore some of the similarities between the totalitarian systems of the 20th century and Orwell's 1984. And as will become evident, many of these totalitarian traits are re-emerging in the modern world. This investigation will be conducted in the recognition that totalitarianism relies on mass support, and so contemporary societies desperately need more people to withdraw their support of this brutal form of rule. Shortly after 1984 was published, Orwell explained, "The moral to be drawn from this dangerous nightmare situation is a simple one. Don't let it happen. It depends on you." Totalitarianism is a political system whereby a centralized state apparatus attempts to control virtually all aspects of life. Everything within the state, nothing outside the state, nothing against the state, the Italian dictator Mussolini succinctly put it. While totalitarianism can emerge under the guise of various political ideologies, in the 20th century it was communism and fascism that provided the ideological support for this type of rule. Communism and fascism are often viewed as being on opposite ends of the political spectrum, but in the manner they were put into practice in the 20th century, both of these systems displayed the characteristics of the totalized, all-controlling state. Both used force and propaganda to attain power, crush economic and civil liberties, smother culture, partake in mass surveillance, and terrorize the citizenry with psychological warfare and eventually mass imprisonment and mass murder. Speaking of Stalin's communist Russia and Hitler's Nazi Germany, Orwell explained, "The two regimes, having started from opposite ends, are rapidly evolving towards the same system, a form of oligarchical collectivism. In the communist and fascist political systems of the 20th century and in 1984, the totalitarian regime maintained a tight grip of control on the populace through the use of manufactured fear."
You got to be kidding me.
You know the definition of insanity, folks? Repeating the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result.
Totalitarian leaders, whether of the right or of the left, know better than anyone else how to make use of fear. They thrive on chaos and bewilderment. The strategy of fear is one of their most valuable tactics. In 1984, continuous war between the three superstates perpetuated this state of fear. It was not important who was at war with who, or who was allied with who, as this was changing all the time.
Right now, Ukraine. Hint, hint, wink, wink.
And the point of the war was not for one superstate to conquer another, but for all three superstates to work behind the scenes to create the conditions of terror that would enable them all to institute totalitarian controls within their own borders.
They're only going
Constant
to dig
surveillance
in
of
deeper.
all of the
We should
citizens
hit
was an
them now.
additional tool in the arsenal of the totalitarian regime of 1984. Surveillance not only allowed
Nowadays, your toaster is connected to the internet. Your frickin' fridge can tell you when you need a new grocery list. And people are ignoring this.
out for more effective overt control of the citizenry, but it also induced paranoia, which made it less likely that any citizen would even dare step out of line. This surveillance was achieved, firstly, through the technology of the telescreen, which was installed in everyone's home and throughout the streets, and as Orwell explained, the telescreen received and transmitted simultaneously. There was of course no way of knowing whether you were being watched at any given moment. It was even conceivable that they watched everybody all the time.
Now, in the real world, every piece of tech has an RFID chip that's constantly sending and receiving at the same time. Always watched, always listened.
But at any rate, they could plug in your wire whenever they wanted to. You had to live, did live, from habit that became instinct, in the assumption that every sound you made was overheard, and, except in darkness, every movement scrutinized. Secondly, mass surveillance of the citizenry was conducted by the citizens of 1984 themselves. Each person watched everyone else, and each person was, in turn, watched by everyone else. The most innocent of expressions, an innocuous statement, or a subtle look of disapproval when Big Brother appeared on the telescreen, was reported to the thought police and treated as a thought crime or a face crime, as evidence that one was disloyal and had something to hide. It is intolerable to us that an erroneous thought should exist anywhere in the world, however secret and powerless it may be, Orwell has the character O'Brien explain. In Stalinist Russia, Alexander Solzhenitsyn noted that one could never be sure whether one's neighbors, friends, co-workers, the postman, or even in some cases one's own family, would report to the secret police a slip of the tongue, a criticism of Stalin or of communism. For if one was reported, their fate was usually sealed. The police would knock at the door in the middle of the night, and soon after one would be given the standard sentence of a tenor, that is, 10 years in the slave labor gulag prison camps. This form of surveillance created social conditions wherein most citizens adopted hypocrisy and lying as a way of life, or as Solzhenitsyn explains in the Gulag Archipelago, the permanent lie becomes the only safe form of existence. Every wag of the tongue can be overheard by someone, every facial expression observed by someone. Therefore, every word, if it does not have to be a direct lie, is nonetheless obliged not to contradict the general, common lie. There exists a collection of ready-made phrases, of labels, a selection of ready-made lies. In addition to a ubiquitous state of fear, in totalitarianism there exists a widespread state of confusion and mental disorientation amongst the citizenry. Many victims of totalitarianism have told me in interviews that the most upsetting experience they faced was the feeling of loss of logic, the state of confusion into which they had been brought, the state in which nothing had any validity. They simply did not know what was what. In 1984, widespread mental disorientation was stimulated via the falsification of history and the negation of the concept of objective truth. The Ministry of Truth was the institution which falsified history. Everything faded into mist. The past was erased. The eraser was forgotten. The lie became truth. One of the reasons totalitarian regimes attempt to alter history is because it rids the society of any past reference points or standards of comparison, which might remind the citizens that life in the past was so much better than it is in the sterile and oppressive present. Within 20 years at the most,
Look how many statues have been defaced and torn down. That actually had real good history behind it. True meanings and things that needed to not be forgotten.
Huge and simple question, was life better before the revolution than it is now? Would have ceased once and for all to be answerable, wrote Orwell. But another reason history is falsified by totalitarians is to ensure there are no historical roots to which the citizen can anchor and find a truth, sustenance, and strength. In totalitarianism, there can be no historical information which contradicts or puts into question the reigning political ideology, nor any institution, such as religion, which offers the individual a refuge from the influence of the state. And so as Orwell wrote in 1984, every record has been destroyed or falsified. Every book has been rewritten. Every picture has been repainted. Every statue and street and building has been renamed. Every date has been altered. And that process is continuing day by day and minute by minute. History has stopped. Nothing exists except an endless present in which the party is always right. Along with destroying or falsifying the past, widespread mental disorientation is further cultivated by destroying the belief in objective truth. This is done through a program of psychological warfare. Incessant and intentionally confusing propaganda, conflicting reports, and blatant lies are pumped out in official reports and through the mass media at all hours of the day. What is said today has no bearing on what may be said tomorrow, for as Orwell explained, the totalitarian state sets up unquestionable dogmas, and it alters them from day to day. It needs the dogmas because it needs absolute obedience from its subjects, but it cannot avoid the changes which are dictated by the needs of power politics. In 1984, for example, the Ministry of Plenty put out a bulletin that they were increasing the chocolate ration to 20 grams a week. Orwell writes, and only yesterday, Winston reflected, it had been announced that the ration was to be reduced to 20 grams a week. Was it possible that the citizens could swallow that after only 24 hours? Yes, they swallowed it. Was he, then, alone in the possession of a memory? In addition, contradictions, hypocrisies, and lies form the foundation of the totalitarian ideology. The totalitarian system presents the enslavement of the individual as his or her liberation. Censoring information is called protecting the truth. The destruction of culture or the economy is called its development. The military occupation of other countries is labeled as the furtherance of freedom and peace. In 1984, the Ministry of Peace instigated wars. The Ministry of Truth manufactured propaganda, and the Ministry of Plenty created shortages. On the enormous pyramidal structure of the Ministry of Truth hung the words, war is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. The official ideology abounds with contradictions even when there is no practical reason for them, Orwell explained in 1984. These contradictions are not accidental. The purpose of this all-encompassing program of psychological warfare is to bewilder the mind of the average citizen. For when the citizen is bombarded with contradictions and lies and lives in what Orwell called that shifting phantasmagoric world in which black may be white tomorrow and yesterday's weather can be changed by decree, he or she eventually ceases to know what to think or even how to think. The distinction between up and down, fact and fiction, truth and falsity, is not only blurred, but loses significance. The belief in objective truth disappears, and the average citizen becomes completely dependent on authority figures to feed him ideas, and thus is ready to assent to lies and to believe the most absurd things, so long as those in the political class deem it to be true. The Soviet official Georgy Pyatakov explained that the true Bolshevik would be ready to believe that black was white and white was black if the party required it. There was no particle left inside him which was not at one with the party, did not belong to it. In an essay titled Totalitarianism and the Lie, Leszek Kolakowski, a philosopher who was exiled from Poland for his criticisms of communism and Marxism, wrote, "This is what totalitarian regimes keep unceasingly trying to achieve. People whose memory, personal or collective, has been nationalized, has become state-owned and perfectly malleable, totally controllable, are entirely at the mercy of their rulers. They have been deprived of their identity. They are helpless and incapable of questioning anything they are told to believe. They will never revolt, never think, never create. They have been transformed into dead objects." In 1984, the main character Winston manages for most of the book to stand psychologically outside the grasp of the party and its leader Big Brother, despite the widespread fear and mental disorientation which swirls around him. "Down with Big Brother," he writes in his diary early in the book. However, after being arrested by the thought police and subjected to re-education, Winston abdicates his reason and conscience and begins to accept the lies. He joins the totalitarian cult and becomes another brick in the wall of the all-powerful state. Referring to Winston, Orwell writes, "He could not fight against the party any longer. Besides, the party was in the right. It was merely a question of learning to think as they thought." The pencil felt thick and awkward in Winston's fingers. He began to write down the thoughts that came into his head. He wrote first in large clumsy capitals, "Freedom is slavery." Then almost without a pause, he wrote beneath it, "2 and 2 make 5." The struggle was finished. He had won the victory over himself. He loved Big Brother. Some have taken this ending as a sign of Orwell's pessimism, as an indication that humanity is doomed to a totalitarian future. Yet Orwell's motive for writing this book was not to depress, nor promote a fatalistic apathy, but to warn and rouse to action as many people as possible. For Orwell understood as well as anyone that in the battle between totalitarianism and freedom, no one can afford to stand aside. The fate of each and every one of us hangs in the balance.
This Easter, discover a new way to enjoy the irresistibly smooth.
In his 1958 book, Brave New World Revisited, Aldous Huxley wrote the following: "If the first half of the 20th century was the era of the technical engineers, the second half may well be the era of the social engineers. And the 21st century, I suppose, will be the era of world controllers, the scientific caste system, and Brave New World." 30 years prior to penning these words, Huxley wrote his classic work of fiction, Brave New World. Set in the distant future, this book depicts a scientifically managed dystopian society. In Brave New World, the ruling authorities attain mass compliance not through force, but by supplying the masses with endless streams of distracting entertainment, and manipulating them with drugs and other technological methods. Huxley wrote Brave New World as a warning. Advances in science and technology, he believed, were paving the way for the type of society depicted in this book, and he cautioned that if a Brave New World type of order solidifies, it could be the final or ultimate revolution. The people will have their liberties taken from them, but they will enjoy their servitude and so never question it, let alone rebel. In a 1962 interview at Berkeley University, Huxley explained, "It seems to me that the nature of the ultimate revolution with which we are now faced is precisely this, that we are in the process of developing a whole series of techniques, which will enable the controlling oligarchy, who have always existed and will always exist, to get people to love their servitude. According to Huxley, this brave new world totalitarianism was most likely to solidify in the 21st century. And so in this video, we are going to examine whether Huxley's predictions are coming true. Do we live in a brave new world? In Brave New World Revisited, Huxley wrote the following. In 1931, when Brave New World was being written, I was convinced that there was still plenty of time. The completely organized society, the scientific caste system, the abolition of free will by methodical conditioning, the servitude made acceptable by regular doses of chemically induced happiness. These were coming, all right, but not in my time, not even in the time of my grandchildren. 27 years later, I feel a good deal less optimistic than I did when I was writing Brave New World. The prophecies made in 1931 are coming true much sooner than I thought they would. The nightmare of total organization has emerged from the safe, remote future and is now awaiting us just around the next corner. In Brave New World, advances in psychology made it possible for the ruling authorities to use mind control to condition citizens from an early age to think and behave in ways that were submissive and conformist. Nearly 100 years after Huxley wrote his dystopian novel, has this type of conditioning left the realm of fiction and entered reality? Today, the art of mind control is in the process of becoming a science, Huxley wrote in 1958. The practitioners of this science know what they are doing and why. They are guided in their work by theories and hypotheses solidly established on a massive foundation of experimental evidence. While the idea of mind control may sound like science fiction, in the mid to late 20th century, many prominent philosophers, psychologists, and scientists joined Huxley in sounding the alarm bell that research into the fundamentals of this phenomenon were well underway. In 1953, the distinguished British philosopher Bertrand Russell explained, "It is to be expected that advances in physiology and psychology will give governments much more control over individual mentality than they now have even in totalitarian countries." The renowned 20th century American clinical psychologist Carl Rogers warned that the rapid development of the behavioral sciences, which is a cluster of scientific disciplines, including psychology, psychiatry, sociology, social psychology, anthropology and biology, economic and political science, mathematics and statistics, was in the process of becoming what he called an if-then science. By this he meant that scientists and social engineers were discovering that if carefully constructed conditions are implemented in a society, then there is a high probability that the majority of citizens will respond to these conditions in predictable and hence controllable ways. Or as he wrote in 1954, "I believe that too few people are aware of the extent, the breadth, and the depth of the advances which have been made in recent decades in the behavioral sciences. The increasing power for control which it gives will be held by someone or some group. Such an individual or group will surely choose the purposes or goals to be achieved, and most of us will then be increasingly controlled by means so subtle we will not even be aware of them as controlled.
We just gotta wait for it to get nice.
It appears that some form of completely controlled society is coming." In a report released in 2021,
Yeah.
scientists on a subcommittee of the Scientific
We have a cold spell coming through right now. Like, you got a heavy snowfall warning, you got a cold spell, we got, you name it.